Are there any signs of World War III? And who would want World War III? And what would be the outcome of World War III? First of all, what's the history between Russia and Ukraine? I tried to do a little bit of research, and what I did find out, according to what I read, what we know Ukraine today, the territory of Ukraine, is actually the first place where the first Russians came from. So before Moscow became the capital and St. Petersburg and all that, most Russians came from Ukraine, and Ukraine, they're very similar. Obviously, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union from Lenin's times until the fall of the Berlin Wall in, I think it was November of 1989. And so they were basically the same country. And I have some friends from Ukraine, and they told me everybody studied Russian in school growing up. So Ukraine and Russia have always had shared common culture, common history. Ukraine has had, very tough times also during the Second World War and the Germans and all that. So, Ukraine is basically Russia's access to the sea, right? And, Ukraine is huge. If you look at a map, I think Ukraine is huge. It's like Europe. It's as big as Europe. And basically, Ukraine and Russia share so many things in common. And that's also why the situation is so tricky. And also Ukraine being almost as big as all of Western Europe, if not bigger. It's a huge territory, and nobody really knows how it's going to end between Russia and Ukraine. And the history between the US and Russia has always been very, very tricky. As we know, the Cold War lasted many, many decades, and it was a very tense moment historically where people were very afraid of nuclear war and nuclear disaster between the two countries. And there were some proxy wars, but they never fought head to head. And they've always had very close interactions with each other's borders, with each other's territories. Of course, Alaska used to be Russian territory, and I believe we bought it. I don't know what the price was, and something like that. So also on the border with Florida, obviously, with the whole Russian missile crisis during the Kennedy administration, Russia was sending missiles, nuclear missiles, to Cuba, and that was very, very tense situation where even people at the White House in Kennedy's administration were very, very afraid that they were on the brink of nuclear war. So Russia and America have always been great powers. America is the newest power. Russia has been an empire for hundreds and hundreds of years. And even after the Tsars fell, after the revolution, the Soviet Revolution, the Bolsheviks, that was definitely showing also the difference between the United States and Russia. Obviously, Russia becoming a communist country, and also in terms of size. Russia is huge. I think it has more landmass, more territory than the United States. Obviously, the United States has more population, I believe, because most of Russia, especially since it's so huge, most of it doesn't have any inhabitants. I saw a documentary where I think the Russian government has a program where they pay their citizens to go live in the wilderness. So they're paid by the government to basically live in places where nobody's around, just to kind of, I guess, manage the area, or, kind of as some type of citizen police or something, or a ranger. And so the US and Russia have never seen eye to eye. This is also reflected in sports, in the Olympics. The US and Russia have always gone head to head in Olympic sports. The two countries have always competed for the top spots in who would win the first gold medals. And obviously a great example is the hockey teams had really a historic game. I think it was for the gold. I think America won, I'm not sure. US and Russia have never been friends. Even after 1989, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the American government was hoping to be able to have it transition into a, modern, democratic, free market system similar to the United States and its allies. And that did not happen for many reasons. And still today, there's many historians, many researchers that write many books about this, because it was such a chaotic time and there was so many complex things happening at the same time. So, even in the 90s, the US was not able to bring it into its orbit. And who knows if that was just because the Russians didn't want to. Not enough Russians wanted to become close allies to the US. What if maybe even a part of the more hawkish, patriotic American leaders, maybe even some of those leaders, did not view it very positively to have Russia as a very close ally? Because sometimes to maintain the status quo and not complicate things, politicians choose to keep everything as it is, as to not complicate anything new and as to not make anything new happen, just to make sure that everything stays as it is. So the US and Russia have always had completely different ways of viewing the world. And you obviously notice that in the two different political systems that they had in the last century, which was one of the main reasons of the Cold War, right? One was the liberal democratic system with a free market, which was the United States. And on the other side, which wasn't just the other side, but it was pretty clearly the opposite side, in contrast, was the Russian system of, I think they called it socialist realism or realist socialism or something. And it was the application of Marxist thought on society as a whole. So I think the Russian Revolution was the first successful socialist or communist revolution. Because I know that there was some small uprising in Germany, maybe having to do with Rosa Luxemburg or something, in Munich or one of the big cities, and that I think that just lasted like a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and then they crushed it, and there was some very serious repercussions or something like that. But yeah, so the U.S. and Russia always having completely different economic systems, the military systems always going against each other. Obviously, one of the most fascinating and interesting parts of the relationship and the history between the United States and Russia is the legendary battles fought between the Russian Secret Service and obviously on the other side, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency in America. And we've read so many great books and seen so many great films about the Cold War and about the KGB against the CIA and CIA going after the KGB and all this espionage and honeypots, I think it's the correct word for one of these strategies or techniques, and the spies and the love stories between the spies and all the fun and romantic conspiracies and it's so great. I think those are one of my favorite books and films are, things about the Cold War or about, American spies and Russian spies. It's just so fascinating and romantic, and it never gets old. It's kind of like its own genre now, right? It's kind of like the Western films, right? Which were about a specific place and a specific time, and it became a whole genre in its own. Maybe the Cold War will become its own genre, kind of like World War II films, are kind of their own genre, right? There's all kinds of World War II films, but they're their own genre, right? Like Spielberg made a couple of really good ones, like Saving Private Ryan and Schindler's List. Not very happy and fun films, but you could see like the quality, like the filmmaking quality and the production and the talent and the acting. It's just good films, but a lot of good film noirs, especially from the early years of the Cold War, right? Like especially the 50s. It was called the Red Scare, right? And they had so many film noirs about it with so many great actors, and especially film noirs made in the US and made in England. Definitely different types of ways of making spy films and ways of making film noirs. Definitely different. The style of those kinds of films made in England at the time were more traditional and classic and had to do with the royal family, or had to do with, the upper class and, spies being recruited at Oxford and Cambridge. So the Russian films and the British books and films and entertainment about the, spies in the Cold War were more based on traditional and classical English literature in terms of the setting and the protagonists and the storyline. And the US were definitely more films and books that were more based on pulp novels, for example, and more about business or about crime or about more lower middle class situations. And even if it was having to do with maybe military spies, it wasn't like the heads, like a lot of the books and films in England, where a lot of the books and films about the Cold War, about the British spies and leaders. In America, was more about like the middleman, the handler, the spy, the simple spies, not the managers and the leaders of the spies. It has been so long since the war in Ukraine started, and at the beginning, everybody thought it might have been like in Crimea in 2014 when Russia, very short-lived thing, and it wasn't a full-scale attack and war like we see today. And, the war has so many different points of view and things happening at the same time that I don't even think we realize yet what happened and what's happening and what's going to happen. I think there's still a general confusion, and a lot of people, most people, have no idea what's really going on the ground, because we're getting a lot of different type of news from different sources and different opinions, even from the same areas of the military, of government, of business. A lot of people have different opinions, and you see it every day on television, on the news, online. And the last thing that you want is for people to start arguing about the different things and the different options and the different methods of dealing with this situation and the scenarios and outcomes. So the worst case scenario would be that we start fighting against each other about what we should or shouldn't do with Russia and what we should or shouldn't do about Ukraine. That would be a waste of time and energy if we started arguing about what we should or shouldn't do amongst each other. So with so much information, and so also part of this information that we're receiving is contradictory as well. So part of the job isn't just to find information, but also to have the time and energy to be able to analyze it and understand, where's this information coming from? Is there a source behind it? What's the source? Does the source have any agenda or preconceived notions about the situation? And you never know, because obviously you're not on the ground there. You have no idea what's going on. You only see and hear and read what you're being fed from the media. And it also depends which media you listen to. So that's part of the risk of not knowing how to get and receive the correct information about the war in Ukraine, which is a war between Russia and Ukraine, but it's probably just as much a war between Russia and the United States. I don't know what you might think about this, but there are many reasons why the war between Russia and Ukraine could very well be a war between Russia and the United States. And the war is only getting worse day by day, month by month, year by year. The Americans and Russians just don't get along. There's nothing anyone can do about it. China has started to try to mediate between the United States and Russia, but nobody knows if China realistically either has the intentions of mediating between the two or has the capacity to mediate between the two. Because China's interest in the war continuing might outweigh China's interest in peace between Russia and the US, Russia and Ukraine. Russia is at China's border. Russia is a big power. China is a big power. A war with Ukraine and the United States, Russia will be weakened by the economic toll and the military toll on the human life of Russians and the general morale of the population, that China will find itself next to a weaker neighbor. Maybe the weakest Russia has been compared to China ever in history. Because if you think about it, in the last 100 years, Russia has declined economically, politically, militarily, from an industrial point of view as well. China has been the opposite. China has had almost unstoppable growth. And the difference between China and Russia is becoming greater and greater. And the gap between the two countries is growing further apart. Now, the other part of the world that has a huge stake in the war, whether it continues or not, is Europe, is the European Union. Obviously, the European Union doesn't exist according to Henry Kissinger, who said famously, if I need to call any country, I know who to call, right? I call the president. If I need to talk to Europe, who do I call? There's no European head of state. there's no real power in that sense, in terms of executive power, in an individual, in a single figure that represents the whole of Europe. Europe doesn't have that. But Europe definitely depends on Russia for its energy, its gas, especially, and especially in the last decades, there has been new construction in terms of pipelines going from Russia to different parts of Europe. So I think Europe might be Russia's biggest client in terms of energy consumption. And I think that's one of the main reasons why Germany, compared to other more hawkish countries like Poland, for example, why Germany has instead been a little bit more hesitant in terms of sending weapons, in terms of economic sanctions, in terms of embargo, because Germany, much more the United Kingdom, and much more than other members of the European Union, Germany is tied to Russia, especially for its gas and energy, but in general for its economy. Germany has such a huge interest and depends on Russian energy so much. And that's why Germany has been much more hesitant and has had much more doubts in terms of how it acts according to other countries in the European Union. Because obviously, Germany, let's face it, is the leader in Europe. It has the greatest economic power and it has the greatest political power. We've seen it recently in the huge success and the longevity that the Chancellor Angela Merkel has had in the last decades. And Germany and Russia also have always had strong political and commercial ties, which is also reflected from the positions that the Russian companies have offered former Chancellor Schröder, Gerhard Schröder, the former socialist leader. I think he was a lawyer as well. And after he worked as a chancellor, so after he worked as the head of the German government, what happened was that Gerhard Schröder was offered a couple of, allegedly he was offered a couple of seats and positions as a board member of one or two Russian companies. I believe they were allegedly tied to gas or energy. And we also know the history of gas and energy because of some American politicians that, for the sake of our conversation, shall remain nameless, who have famously had ties to Ukraine because of the commercial operations and investments in the energy and gas sectors. So the relationship between Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and Europe is really at the center of the war and at the center of what happened before, what's happening now, and what might happen in the future. What are the signs of a world war starting? I've asked myself this question because many journalists and many people in the news have been talking about the risk and the realistic possibility of a direct conflict between the US and Russia, and a direct conflict between the European countries and Russia. This is very alarming because when you ask yourself what are the signs of a world war, you need to look back to the Second World War and especially to the First World War. So the First World War was originally called the Great War, I think, and it was from somewhere around 1914 to somewhere around 1918, 1919, something like that, depending on the country that was involved. Some started in 14, other countries started in 1915. And what sparked this war was the incident in Sarajevo that was an incident against the Archduke. I think his name was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the last heir to the old Habsburg Empire, headquartered in Vienna. And it was one of the oldest European royal families and European aristocratic families in the history of Europe. It was one of the oldest and one of the most powerful. And you can still see today how powerful it was by how beautiful places like Vienna and Budapest. Obviously, Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was the name of it. And that's why the parliament there is also very, very beautiful. And so what happened in Sarajevo against the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is what sparked the First World War. And it was a very, very tragic event. And there were many losses on all sides. And I think after the war in England, I think more than 50% of aristocratic families were basically extinct because all the young men who were the future of these families did not come back from the war. So many British aristocratic families were lost forever because there were no young generations to bring forward these ancient families. And the First World War really was a domino effect of countries going against each other and declaring war on each other. So while the Second World War is more famous because you see it more often in books and films compared to the First World War, the Second World War was mostly about one country. So the difference between the First World War and the Second World War was that the First World War was allegedly started by Germany, and the Second World War was started by Germany. So the signs there, in hindsight, were obvious, but in those times, they weren't that obvious. And the signs of the Second World War or First World War not being so obvious is especially apparent in the way the leaders of the Second World War acted at the beginning, because they didn't take seriously what was happening in Germany, and a lot of them were also positive about what was happening in Germany, because a lot of people in the United States and in Great Britain were so worried about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the Soviet Union that, compared to Germany, Russia seemed much more of a threat in terms of geopolitical reasons and economically, and also philosophically, because of the difference between capitalism and communism. So the signs were many today that we see, we study it in the history books. But at the time, they did not have the information also to understand what was happening everywhere at what time, right? Apart from the intelligence and military leaders who knew what was happening because they were checking on their data, and the people, all the researchers and analysts who work for them, the in general population didn't really know what was happening until it was too late, and that was very, very, very bad, and the results were very, very bad. And the signs today of a world war, it could be the fact that Russia has no intention of stopping the war, and Putin has no intention of stopping the war. And in America, Washington seems to not really have any intention of stopping the war either, apart from a few exceptions. But that seems to be a bit of a pity, the fact that there isn't more of a general consensus, a wider general consensus about the essential importance of peace. Because we don't want to make the same mistakes that were made in the past. So we don't want the signs that we're not seeing to accumulate until it's too late and there's no way out. So we really should be much more careful and much more interested in reaching peace. The issue is that everybody not directly connected to the war in Ukraine, everybody not directly connected to war in Ukraine seems to be more favorable to reaching peace as soon as possible. The issue is that the three main players in this war, which are Putin and Russia, Zelenskyy and Ukraine, and Biden and the United States, these three players that are the three main protagonists of these battles, they do not seem to be favorable to peace that much. I don't think the majority of leaders in Kiev or leaders in Moscow or leaders in Washington, I don't think the elites of those three countries are looking for peace right now. And I don't know why. I have my doubts. And the hope is that they will change more sooner than later. And what we really want to know also is, has World War III already started and we just haven't realized it yet? Have we already gone beyond the signs? How do we know if we're already in World War III? Is there going to be an official communication of the escalation, or will it just happen behind our backs without us even noticing it? Has World War III already started and we haven't noticed it yet? I don't know. And it'll probably be too late by the time we notice. And who knows what the outcome of a world war would be. It would definitely not be a good outcome for anybody. It would be a disaster for Russia. It would be a disaster for Europe. And it would be a disaster for Ukraine and the United States. And to watch more videos on the military, click on this playlist card. Thanks for watching. Smash the like, click subscribe, and watch the next video here.